Welcome to the Underclass Podcast with Austin Picard. I'm an independent researcher who can't stomach being lied to on a daily basis by the mainstream media. While we live in a fracturing society, launched into parallel realities, falling perfectly onto the two sides of the political spectrum, I remain in the underclass. The issue is whether we want to live in a free society or whether we want to live under what amounts to a form of self-imposed totalitarianism, with the bewildered herd marginalized, directed elsewhere, terrified, screaming patriotic slogans, fearing for their lives, and admiring with awe the leader who saved them from destruction, while the educated masses goose-step on command and repeat the slogans they're supposed to repeat, and the society deteriorates at home. He who controls the media controls the minds of the public. Noam Chomsky. William Colby once said, "The Central Intelligence Agency owns everyone of any significance in the major media." William Colby served as Director of Central Intelligence from September 1973 to January 1976 under Presidents Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford, during which he came under intense scrutiny due to the very public hearings investigating intelligence activities. The Church Committee and the Pike Committee had been formed by members of Congress in 1975 in order to hold these public hearings investigating abuses by the Central Intelligence Agency. And Colby inevitably served as the face of the CIA during this time, even being praised by members of the media to this day, claiming that he adopted a policy of openness and accountability. However, I believe that all he truly did was play the role he was always intended to fulfill, which was providing cover for the agency while offering as little information as possible to the committees during the investigation. Idaho Democratic Senator Frank Church was asked about the evidence being exposed in regard to a CIA-sponsored propaganda operation during the course of the hearings, and the president of CBS News, Sig Mickelson, was also asked about his involvement with the CIA during his time in charge at CBS.
I thought that it was a matter of real concern that planted stories intended to serve a national purpose abroad came home and were circulated here and believed here, because this would mean that the CIA could manipulate the news in the United States by channeling it through some foreign country. And we're looking at that very carefully.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to a major circulation American journal?
We do have people who submit pieces to two American journals.
Do you have any people paid by the CIA who are working for television networks?
This, I think, gets into the kind of getting into the details, Mr. Chairman, that I'd like to get into in executive session.
At CBS, we had been contacted by the CIA. As a matter of fact, by the time I became the head of the whole news and public affairs operation in 1954, ships had been established, and I was told about them and asked if I'd carry on with them.
We have quite a lot of detailed information, and we will evaluate it, and we will include any evidence of wrongdoing or any evidence of impropriety in our final report and make recommendations.
Do you have any people being paid by the CIA who are contributing to the national news services, AP and UPI.
Well, again, I think we're getting into the kind of detail, Mr. Chairman, that I'd prefer to handle in executive session.
Senator, do you think that you named the news organizations in your final report?
That remains to be decided.
I think it was entirely in order for our correspondents at that time to make use of CIA agent chiefs of station and other members of the executive staff of CIA as sources of information which were useful in their assessments of world conditions.
Would you say that continues today?
Well, I would think probably for a reporter it would continue today, but because of all of the revelations of the period of the 1970s, it seems to me that a reporter's got to be much more circumspect in doing it now, or he runs the risk of at least being looked at with considerable disfavor by the public. I think you've got to be much more careful about it.
In a document prepared by the Senate Select Committee to study governmental operations with respect to intelligence activities, they claimed that the origins of the public revelations that exposed the covert CIA propaganda operation, known as Operation Mockingbird, began in the 1973 Senate Watergate Committee investigation, which revealed that the executive branch had directed national intelligence agencies to carry out constitutionally questionable domestic security operations. In 1974, Pulitzer Prize-winning journalist Seymour Hersh published a front-page New York Times article claiming that the CIA had been spying on anti-war activists for more than a decade, violating the agency's charter. Former CIA officials and some lawmakers, including Senator William Proxmire and Stuart Symington, called for a congressional inquiry. The committee decided that most of its hearings would be held in closed executive sessions in order to protect intelligence sources and methods. The committee held a series of public hearings in September and October of 1975 to educate the American public about the unlawful or improper conduct of the intelligence community, highlighting a few carefully selected cases of misconduct. These hearings examined a CIA biological agents program, a White House domestic surveillance program, IRS intelligence activities, and the FBI's program to disrupt the civil rights and anti-Vietnam War movements. These nationally televised events offered the American public an opportunity to learn about the secret operations conducted for decades by U.S. intelligence agencies. After holding 126 full committee meetings, 40 subcommittee hearings, interviewing some 800 witnesses in public and closed sessions, and combing through 110,000 documents, the committee published its final report on April 29, 1976. Investigators determined that, beginning with President Franklin Roosevelt's administration and continuing through the early 1970s, intelligence excesses at home and abroad were not the product of any single party, administration, or man, but had developed as America rose to become a superpower during a global Cold War. Intelligence agencies have undermined the constitutional rights of citizens, the final report concluded, primarily because checks and balances designed by the framers of the Constitution to assure accountability have not been applied. In episode 15, we break free from the bewildered herd, reminding ourselves that perception is reality, as we pierce through the veil of covert political propaganda, opening our eyes to the psychological warfare meant to influence public opinion on a massive scale. In an effort to expose the preemptive obfuscation of our perceived reality through the machinations of clandestine operators, we are faced with the unfortunate prospect of a failed state, losing the battle to socially engineered information warfare. In order to properly set the stage for what was to become the origins of Operation Mockingbird and the CIA's inextricable connections with American media outlets and institutions, we must first understand the political landscape of the time fostering such an aggressive policy approach in America. George Kennan was an American diplomat and a member of the group of foreign policy elders known as the Wise Men, and in the late 1940s, according to the National Review, He provided the political analysis that convinced the Truman administration to create covert programs to counteract communist front organizations in Europe. As World War II ended, he held the number 2 position in the American embassy in Moscow. In January 1946, his State Department superiors asked him to provide an evaluation of Soviet intentions in Europe. Kennan drafted a prescient memorandum declaring that the Stalinist dictatorship was committed to a course of territorial expansion that could not be countered by the United States through traditional diplomacy or the negotiation of treaties. Kennan's analysis was published a year later in the influential journal Foreign Affairs under the title The Sources of Soviet Conduct. He proposed that the United States embark on a policy of firm containment, designed to confront the Russians with unilateral counterforce at every point where they show signs of encroaching upon the interests of a peaceful and stable world. Kennan also made this bold prediction. The United States has it in its power to increase enormously the strains under which Soviet policy must operate, to force upon the Kremlin a far greater degree of moderation and circumspection than it has had to observe in recent years, and in this way to promote tendencies which must eventually find their outlet in either the breakup or the gradual mellowing of Soviet power. Kennan stressed that the new threat facing the United States had more than a military dimension. The international communist movement had become adept at advancing Soviet interests through the use of front organizations operating freely within the Western democracies. These progressive groups spoke in innocent-sounding slogans about the need for disarmament, world peace, and social justice, while hiding the fact that they were controlled by Moscow. If the new policy of containment was to be effective, it would have to supplement Western military preparedness with a program to mobilize pro-democracy civic groups in the U.S. and Europe to oppose the communist propaganda machine. Anticipating the problems that might be created for these ostensibly independent citizen groups if it became known that they were accepting subsidies from the U.S. government, Kennan recommended that they be funded covertly. Kennan's containment theory assumed that America would be able to block any Soviet military encroachments while carrying on the anti-communist struggle in the political, economic, and cultural spheres. If the U.S. succeeded, Soviet communism could ultimately be defeated without risking nuclear confrontation. Kennan's analysis helped turn the tide within the upper reaches of the Truman administration toward a more aggressive policy toward the Soviet Union. Indeed, the Foreign Affairs article might have had more influence on the emerging Cold War consensus in Washington than even Winston Churchill's famous Iron Curtain speech delivered in Fulton, Missouri in March 1946. Kennan was soon called back from Moscow and promoted to the position of director of the State Department's policy planning staff. The diplomat turned Cold Warrior then established a new sub-agency called the Office of Special Projects, soon changed to the Office of Policy Coordination, and was given the green light to develop initiatives to counteract the Soviets' international front groups. That's how the CIA's secret funding of the National Student Association began. According to the Journal of American History, on February 14, 1967, the New York Times front page headline read, "A student group concedes it took funds from CIA." The article by the reporter Neil Sheehan unleashed a series of revelations about secret operations of the Central Intelligence Agency. Since the 1950s, the agency had apparently been financing independent private organizations and institutions that seemed to bear little relevance to the official tasks of the CIA, namely to collect information abroad that was relevant to America's national security. The day before, the underground magazine Ramparts bought a full-page ad in the New York Times to publicize its March issue. The ad announced that Ramparts would reveal how the CIA had for many years sponsored the National Student Association, which was the umbrella organization for approximately 400 student clubs, in exchange for services. It has used students to spy. It has used students to pressure international student organizations into taking Cold War positions. and it has interfered in a most shocking manner in the international workings of the nation's largest and oldest student organization, the ad text dramatically announced. Sheehan immediately investigated and received confirmation of the story from the NSA chairman Eugene Groves. From the early 1950s until 1966, the organization had received approximately $200,000 annually in subsidies from a number of foundations that served as channels for CIA money. The funds were primarily used to send NSA delegations to international student meetings, where they were expected to exert a moderating influence on decision-making. When they returned to the United States, the delegates would report to CIA officials about the other student representatives. The National Security Act of 1947 was a law enacting major restructuring of the United States government's military and intelligence agencies following World War II. This dissolved the National Intelligence Authority, NIA, and the Central Intelligence Group, CIG, which was the direct predecessor of the CIA. This 1947 National Security Act also established the National Security Council and the Central Intelligence Agency. In the book Legacy of Ashes, The History of the CIA, the author explains that the CIA had different demands placed on it by the various bodies overseeing it. Truman wanted a centralized group to organize the information that reached him. The Department of Defense wanted military intelligence and covert action, and the State Department wanted to create global political change favorable to the U.S. Thus, the two areas of responsibility for the CIA were covert action and covert intelligence. By June 18, 1948, the National Security Council issued Directive 10-2, calling for covert action against the USSR and granting the authority to carry out covert operations against hostile foreign states or groups that could, if needed, be denied by the U.S. government. To this end, the Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, was created inside the new CIA. The OPC was unique. Frank Wisner, the head of the OPC, answered not to the CIA director, but to the Secretaries of Defense, State, and the National Security Council. The OPC's actions were a secret even from the head of the CIA. Most CIA stations had two station chiefs, one working for the OSO and one working for the OPC. Frank Wisner had been a member of the Office of Strategic Services since as early as 1943, and by 1947 he was recruited to join the State Department by the Secretary of State, who set the foreign policy for the Truman administration. After the National Security Act of 1947 was officially approved and the Office of Special Projects was formally established and renamed to the Office of Policy Coordination, Wisner was chosen to lead the OPC as Assistant Director for Policy Coordination. According to its secret charter, the OPC's responsibilities include propaganda, economic warfare, preventative direct action, including sabotage, anti-sabotage, demolition and evacuation procedures, subversion against hostile states, including assistance to underground resistance groups, guerrillas and refugee liberation groups, and support of indigenous anti-communist elements in threatened countries of the free world. What could go wrong? Author Deborah Davis wrote in her 1979 biography of Katharine Graham, owner of the Washington Post, that the CIA ran an Operation Mockingbird during this time, writing that the Prague-based International Organization of Journalists, IOJ, received money from Moscow and controlled reporters on every major newspaper in Europe, disseminating stories that promoted the communist cause, and that Frank Wisner, director of the OPC, had created Operation Mockingbird in response to the IOJ. He then recruited Phil Graham, who served as publisher and later co-owner of the Washington Post and its parent company, to run the project within the industry. And according to Davis, by the early 1950s, Wisner owned respected members of the New York Times, Newsweek, CBS, and other communications vehicles. By 1951, Wisner would succeed Alan Dulles becoming the second deputy director of plans with Richard Helms as his chief of operations. After leaving the Washington Post in 1977, Carl Bernstein, known primarily for his work with Bob Woodward exposing much of the original news reporting on the Watergate scandal, spent 6 months investigating the relationship of the CIA and the press during the Cold War years. The title of the article was "The CIA and the Media: How Americans' Most Powerful News Media Worked Hand in Glove with the Central Intelligence Agency, and Why the Church Committee Covered It Up." In the article, he briefly outlines the process of recruiting journalists as intelligence assets, writing, "Often the CIA's relationship with a journalist might begin informally with a lunch, a drink, a casual exchange of information. An agency official might then offer a favor, for example, a trip to a country difficult to reach. In return, he would seek nothing more than the opportunity to debrief the reporter afterward. A few more lunches, a few more favors, and only then might there be a mention of a formal arrangement. That came later," said a CIA official, "after you had the journalist on a string." Another official described a typical example of the way accredited journalists, either paid or unpaid by the CIA, might be used by the agency. In return for our giving them information, we'd ask them to do things that fit their roles as journalists, but that they wouldn't have thought of unless we put it in their minds. For instance, a reporter in Vienna would say to our man, "I met an interesting second secretary at the Czech embassy." We'd say, "Can you get to know him? And after you get to know him, can you assess him? And then, can you put him in touch with us? Would you mind us using your apartment?" Formal recruitment of reporters was generally handled at high levels after the journalists had undergone a thorough background check. The actual approach might even be made by a deputy director or division chief. On some occasions, no discussion would be entered into until the journalist had signed a pledge of secrecy. "Secrecy agreement was the sort of ritual that got you into the tabernacle," said a former assistant to the director of Central Intelligence. "After that, you had to play by the rules." David Atlee Phillips, former Western Hemisphere Chief of Clandestine Services and former journalist himself, estimated in an interview that at least 200 journalists signed secrecy agreements or employment contracts with the agency in the past 25 years. Phillips, who owned a small English-language newspaper in Santiago, Chile, when he was recruited by the CIA in 1950, described the approach. "Somebody from the agency says, 'I want you to help me. I know you're a true blue American, but I want you to sign a piece of paper before I tell you what it's about.' I didn't hesitate to sign, and a lot of newsmen didn't hesitate over the next 20 years. One of the things we always had going for us in terms of enticing reporters," observed a CIA official who coordinated some of the arrangements with journalists, "was that we could make them look better with their home offices. A foreign correspondent with ties to the company, the CIA, stood a much better chance than his competitors of getting the good stories." Within the CIA, journalist operatives were accorded elite status, a consequence of the common experience journalists shared with high-level CIA officials. Many had gone to the same schools as their CIA handlers, moved in the same circles, shared fashionably liberal, anti-communist political values, and were part of the same old boy network that constituted something of an establishment elite in the media, politics, and academia of post-war America. The most valued of these lent themselves for reasons of national service, not money. The Covert Action Information Bulletin was a magazine founded by former CIA officer turned agency critic Philip Agee, William Schaap, James and Elsie Wilcott, Ellen Ray, William Kunstler, Michael Ratner, and Lou Wolfe in 1978. It was created in order to carry on the work of the preceding publication, Counter-Spy Magazine, which the editors claimed had been shut down as a result of CIA harassment. Co-editor Lewis Wolf joined a panel discussing their investigation into illegal CIA covert operations, where they address a few of the most notable projects, including the CIA's covert media operations.
Another major story that we uncovered was the whole range of CIA media operations throughout the world. We did an analysis of these operations and the use of money, very large-scale money. It's thought between 1/3 and 40% of the CIA's budget. And I should say that that budget figure is the biggest secret that there is in Washington today. At that time, it was estimated that the 1978 budget was in the range of $1.5 billion. A more recent estimate by a military journal, not a liberal journal by any means, estimated that the CIA's budget today is in the range of $10 billion. At any rate, this analysis that we made of the CIA's media operations disclosed, among other things, that they deliver through CIA couriers ready to print or ready to broadcast news, and I put that in inverted commas, which is used by the media. And this is created by the CIA.
How often does the CIA manipulate the media in this way, plant stories, get their views in the media? Is this fairly common as a modus operandi for the CIA?
It goes beyond your, in the course of the past 30 years, it goes beyond your wildest imagination, the extent to which the CIA has gone to manipulate public opinion. If you include the MH Chaos program, which was $1 billion program of setting up proprietary companies, setting up student organizations so they could draw radical students in and do every kind of duplicitous manipulation of national student movements, press, propaganda, labor, extensive formation of labor unions, funding of major labor unions, with the objective essentially of manipulating the mind and attitudes of workers throughout the nation and the world. This was the essential tool that they used to destabilize Chile and overthrow Allende. Was, of course, making the economy scream, getting to the military officers, but it was essentially the truckers' union that finally brought the country down and justified, quote, justified Pinochet's takeover of power. 5,000 university professors they've co-opted. This is Church Committee revelations. I'm not making this up. It's in print, Church Committee's revelations. 5,000 university professors co-opted to help the CIA manipulate people's minds. 400 journalists in the U.S., including big-name journalists. Now, that's a big chunk of the prominent journalists co-opted to function routinely to help the CIA put out its stories and biases to the world.
There are a whole range of areas wherein the CIA provides briefings to selected journalists, and there are numerous cases where the CIA has, for example, published books, and several thousand books were published in English by the CIA, and this is documented in the Church Committee report. They set up 250 news services and wire services, some of which, not all, but some of which are still in the pocket of the CIA. And I think it's only fair to say that even some journalists who don't realize, there are some who are witting, but there are also some who do not realize that they're being targeted by the CIA when they come home from a trip overseas. They might talk to somebody and they don't realize, at least right away, who they're talking to, and then it turns out that they've been the source of information which was used by the CIA.
And then specific operations around the world from corner to corner to discredit this individual, create an impression about that situation, such as El Salvador, the famous white papers in the Angolan operation, which I note were, you know, back in the good old days, we did a better job. Our white papers in the Angolan operation were based on very specific photographs and hard information of Soviet ships putting into Porto Ambuim in Angola. The white paper that the CIA produced for Alexander Haig to justify the intervention in El Salvador was a piece of trash. It was discredited by the right and the left and the center. It didn't hold together.
I should point, for example, to the the stories that came out during the Angola operation, where it was discovered that the CIA was involved in a massive covert operation, which the Congress cut off when they learned about it. There were certainly a small handful, really a tiny handful, you could count them on the fingers of one hand, of the members of Congress who knew about that operation and the scale of it beforehand, and then they cut it off. Well, one of the revelations at the time that came out was that the CIA had created a story that was planted in the media that the Cubans who were in Angola at the time were raping Angolan women, and that they were really doing very, very gross things to these women and killing them. Well, it was disclosed, in fact, by John Stockwell, among other people, who was the former CIA station chief, or in charge of the CIA's task force in Angola, that that whole story was created by the CIA station in Zambia and in Zaire, where they sat around a table and wrote this story, and then it was fed to a stringer, who then fed it to a news service, who then got it to the AP, Associated Press, who then picked it up and was sent around the world, and it was printed in hundreds of newspapers as fact.
After Frank Wisner was promoted to Deputy Director of Plans, he would go on to be instrumental in the CIA operations to overthrow Mohammad Mossadegh in Iran in 1953, as well as Arbenz in Guatemala in 1954, even being tied to the OPC, helping obtain visas from Nazi collaborators from Belarus, who were believed to have facilitated numerous atrocities. And according to the book Useful Enemies, it was all a part of a Cold War scheme to wage guerrilla warfare in Soviet-occupied Europe, in which the Nazi collaborators were to play a key role. When the project collapsed, however, the Belarusians quickly settled in and obtained U.S. citizenship, and intelligence agencies protected them from exposure for decades. According to an article at Spartacus Educational, in 1951, Allen Dulles persuaded Cord Meyer to join the CIA. However, there is evidence that he was recruited several years earlier and had been spying on the liberal organizations he had been a member of in the later 1940s. According to Deborah Davis, Meyer became Mockingbird's principal operative. One of the most important journalists under the control of Operation Mockingbird was Joseph Alsop, whose articles appeared in over 300 different newspapers. Other journalists willing to promote the views of the CIA included Stuart Alsop, New York Herald Tribune, Ben Bradley, Newsweek, James Reston, New York Times, C.D. Jackson, Time Magazine, Walter Pincus, Washington Post, Walter Winchell, New York Daily Mirror, Drew Pearson, Walter Lippmann, William Allen White, Edgar Ansel Maurer, Chicago Daily News, Hal Hendricks, Miami News, Whitelaw Reid, New York Herald Tribune, Jerry O'Leary, Washington Star, William C. Baggs, Miami News, Herb Gold, Miami News, and Charles L. Bartlett, Chattanooga Times. According to Nina Burley, the author of A Very Private Woman, these journalists sometimes wrote articles that were commissioned by Frank Wisner. The CIA also provided them with classified information to help them with their work. After 1953, the network was overseen by Allen Dulles, director of the CIA. By this time, Operation Mockingbird had a major influence, over 25 newspapers and wire agencies. These organizations were run by people such as William Paley at CBS, Henry Lucci, Time Magazine and Life Magazine, Arthur Hayes Sulzberger, New York Times, Helen Rogers Reed, New York Herald Tribune, Dorothy Schiff, New York Post, Alfred Friendly, managing editor of the Washington Post, Barry Bingham, Louisville Courier-Journal, and James S. Copley, Copley News Services. The Office of Policy Coordination, OPC, was funded by siphoning off funds intended for the Marshall Plan. Some of this money was used to bribe journalists and publishers. Frank Wisner was constantly looking for ways to help convince the public of the dangers of communism. In 1954, Wisner arranged for the funding of the Hollywood production of Animal Farm, the animated allegory based on the book written by George Orwell. According to Alex Constantine, Mockingbird, the subversion of the free press by the CIA. In the 1950s, some 3,000 salaried and contract CIA employees were eventually engaged in propaganda efforts. Wisner was also able to restrict newspapers from reporting about certain events. For example, the CIA plots to overthrow the governments of Iran and Guatemala. May 7, 1973, CIA Director James Schlesinger signed a directive commanding senior officers to compile a report of current or past CIA actions that may have fallen outside the agency's charter. The resulting report came in the form of nearly 700 pages of memos, which were subsequently given to William Colby when he replaced Schlesinger as director of the CIA in late 1973. This set of reports became referred to as the family jewels and detailed illegal, inappropriate, and otherwise sensitive activities conducted by the CIA from 1959 to 1973. William Colby referred to them as the skeletons in the CIA's closet. Schlesinger initially commissioned the reports in response to press accounts of CIA involvement in the Watergate scandal, outing two of the burglars as CIA veterans. And by December 1974, investigative journalist Seymour Hersh would expose some of the contents of the family jewels in a front-page article in the New York Times reporting that the Central Intelligence Agency directly violated its charter, conducting a massive illegal domestic intelligence operation during the Nixon administration against the anti-war movement and other dissident groups in the United States, according to well-placed government sources. According to two Washington Post staff writers, Karen DeYoung and Walter Pincus, most of the documents were released on June 25, 2007, after more than 3 decades of secrecy, due to a FOIA request filed by the non-governmental National Security Archive 15 years before their release. The introduction, given in a 6-page summary of the reports made available at the National Security Archive based at George Washington University, reads, "The Central Intelligence Agency violated its charter for 25 years until revelations of illegal wiretapping, domestic surveillance, assassination plots, and human experimentation led to official investigations and reforms in the 1970s. After the complete set of documents were released on the CIA website, many redactions have been made, including a number of pages in their entirety. In a briefing provided by CIA Director William Colby to the Justice Department on December 31, 1974, included 18 issues of legal concern. 1. Confinement of a KGB defector might be regarded as a violation of the kidnapping laws. 2. Wiretapping of 2 syndicated columnists, Robert Allen and Paul Scott, Project Mockingbird. 3. Physical surveillance of investigative journalist Jack Anderson and his associates, including Les Whitten of The Washington Post and future Fox News Channel anchor and managing editor Britt Hume. Jack Anderson had written 2 articles on CIA-backed assassination attempts on Cuban leader Fidel Castro. 4. Physical surveillance of Michael Gettler, then a Washington Post reporter, who was later an ombudsman for The Washington Post and PBS. 5. Break-in at the home of a former CIA employee. 6. Break-in at the office of a former defector. 7. Warrantless entry into the apartment of a former CIA employee. 8. Opening of mail to and from the Soviet Union from 1953 to 1973, including letters associated with actress Jane Fonda. Project Senior Pointer, HTA Lingual, at JFK Airport. 9. Opening of mail to and from the People's Republic of China from 1969 to 1972. 10. Funding of behavior modification research on unwitting U.S. citizens, including unscientific, non-consensual human experiments. 11. Assassination plots against Cuban President Fidel Castro, Congolese leader Patrice Lumumba, President of the Dominican Republic, and commander-in-chief of the Chilean army. All of these plots were said to be unsuccessful. 12. Surveillance of dissident groups between 1967 and 1971. The Project Resistance, Project Merrimack, and Operation Chaos. 13. Surveillance of a particular Latin American female and of U.S. citizens in Detroit. 14. Surveillance of former CIA officer and agency critic Victor Marchetti, author of the book The CIA and the Cult of Intelligence, published in 1974. 15. Amassing of files on 9,900 plus U.S. citizens related to the anti-war movement. See Project Resistance, Merrimack, and Operation Chaos. 16. Polygraph experiments with the sheriff of San Mateo County, California. 17. Fake CIA identification documents that might violate state laws. And 18. Testing of electronic equipment on U.S. telephone circuits. Operation Mockingbird was the name of the CIA's covert war waged on the minds of the American people using black propaganda operations, not only limited to compromising news publications, but also infiltrating Hollywood production studios in order to influence the production of commercial films. The Church Committee's final report had a section titled Covert Relationships with the United States Media, where Senator Gary Hart claimed, "It hardly reflects what we found. There was a prolonged and elaborate negotiation with the CIA over what would be said." Carl Bernstein wrote, "Obscuring the facts was relatively simple. Colby's misleading public statements about the use of journalists were repeated without serious contradiction or elaboration. The role of cooperating news executives was given short shrift. The fact that the agency had concentrated its relationships in the most prominent sectors of the press went unmentioned. That the CIA continued to regard the press as up for grabs was not even suggested. So here we are, attempting to expose the preemptive obfuscation of our perceived reality through the machinations of clandestine operators, once again faced with the unfortunate prospect of a failed state, losing the battle to socially engineered information warfare.